How did the world get here? How did this centuries-old conflict between East and West begin? From the secret deals at Potsdam to the Iron Curtain dividing Europe, and now to the alliance between China and Russia against the West. This story is not just about the past. It shapes our future. Summer 1945, Potsdam, Germany. Around one table sit Harry Truman, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill, later replaced by Clement Attlee. They are gathered to forge a new world order after the most devastating war in human history. But behind the smiles and staged photographs, the reality is starkly different. The United States arrived at the Potsdam Conference with a significant advantage: the newly developed atomic bomb. President Truman informs Stalin about this weapon, hoping it will provide America with diplomatic leverage. However, Stalin's reaction is unexpectedly calm. Unbeknownst to Truman, Soviet intelligence has already uncovered details of the American nuclear program, and Stalin immediately orders the acceleration of the Soviet atomic project. Meanwhile, as the leaders discuss the fate of post-war Europe, tensions among them become increasingly palpable. Beneath the surface of official agreements lies distrust and fierce competition for influence that will shape the continent's future. The meeting of the victors not only redraws Europe's borders, but also plants the seeds of division. Germany is carved into 4 occupation zones: American, Soviet, British, and French, a clear sign of the Allies' lack of unity. Poland is forced to shift its borders westward, ceding significant territory to the Soviet Union. Southeastern Europe had already fallen within the reach of Soviet influence, bolstered by the Red Army's occupation of the region. Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary were effectively under Kremlin control, with communist parties in these countries consolidating power with Moscow's backing. Stalin framed this as protection against future aggressors, but behind the facade of security lay a deeper agenda, turning Eastern Europe into a buffer zone subordinate to Soviet hegemony. By the time of Potsdam, it was evident the world was on the brink of a new confrontation. The line between East and West wasn't drawn on the battlefield, but across the negotiation table. After the conference, the world entered a new era of division. In 1946, Winston Churchill delivered his famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, declaring, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." This phrase became a symbol of the invisible yet palpable divide separating Europe into 2 opposing worlds: democracy and capitalism in the West versus communism and totalitarianism in the East. The Soviet Union turned Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and other Eastern European countries into satellites. Through political repression, election manipulation, and support for local communist parties, Moscow ensured control over these territories. Soviet leadership justified its actions as a necessity to guard against potential Western aggression. In the eyes of the United States and Western Europe, however, these measures were clear evidence of Kremlin expansionism. While Western Europe embarked on recovery through the Marshall Plan, a massive economic program that boosted industrial production and rebuilt infrastructure, Eastern Europe remained economically isolated. Stalin established the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, to create a self-sufficient socialist economic system, deliberately excluding Western markets. The barrier between these 2 worlds was not only political, but also physical. Trade between East and West was strictly limited, with many essential goods becoming inaccessible to socialist states. Travel between the blocs was heavily controlled, and for ordinary citizens, crossing the Iron Curtain was nearly impossible. This isolation deepened the sense of mistrust and rivalry that would define the Cold War. In response to Soviet expansion, Western powers established NATO in April 1949, a military alliance aimed at collective defense. That same year, on October 1st, the Chinese Civil War ended with a victory for the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. another event heavily influenced by Soviet involvement. Moscow provided Mao with substantial support, including weapons, military advisors, and strategic territories in Manchuria. In 1950, Stalin and Mao signed the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance, which provided significant economic and military aid to the People's Republic of China. The Soviet Union played a key role in China's industrialization, supplying engineers, technology, and financial credits. Initially, relations appeared stable, but everything changed after Stalin's death in 1953. The new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, initiated a policy of de-Stalinization, a move to reassess Stalin's governance. This included dismantling his cult of personality and condemning the repressive measures of his rule. Khrushchev also emphasized the idea of peaceful coexistence with the West, a stance that Mao Zedong viewed as a betrayal of the revolutionary principles of Marxism-Leninism. In the 1960s, the rift between China and the Soviet Union deepened. The USSR halted its aid to China, withdrawing its specialists and leaving numerous projects unfinished. This tension culminated in 1969, when the two countries engaged in armed clashes along the Ussuri River border, transforming allies into rivals. Seeking to balance against the USSR, China began moving closer to the United States. The turning point came in 1972, when President Richard Nixon visited Beijing, a historic event that marked the start of a new era in Chinese diplomacy. Nixon and Chinese leader Mao Zedong discussed various issues, with a primary focus on countering the USSR. This rapprochement not only weakened Moscow's position, but also opened the door for trade and economic cooperation between Beijing and Washington. In the following decades, particularly after Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in the late 1970s, China emerged as a major manufacturing hub, relying on Western investments and technology. Large American corporations such as Apple and Walmart capitalized on cheap labor and the growing potential of the Chinese market. Meanwhile, the United States benefited from affordable goods, which fueled domestic consumption. However, this honeymoon began to crack in the early 21st century. China rapidly rose as a global economic powerhouse, increasing its trade surplus with the US-American companies invested billions in China, while Chinese exports dominated the global market. This led to a significant US trade deficit, which became a central issue in American politics. China's growing technological ambitions have further intensified global tensions. Innovation programs such as Made in China 2025 aim to position the country as a world leader in fields like artificial intelligence, robotics, and semiconductors. These sectors are not only economically critical, but also strategically vital as they define modern industrial and military power. Technological giants like Huawei and ZTE are not only expanding their influence, but are often at the center of international controversies involving cybersecurity and espionage. These companies have become pivotal players in the global confrontation between China and the West. If you want to learn more about Huawei's role and why it has become so controversial, watch this video. After decades of strained relations, Russia and China have now aligned themselves against a common adversary: the dominance of the United States, the dollar, and Western allies. But what underpins this partnership? And can China truly be considered a reliable ally, given its history of shifting geopolitical alliances? What do you think? Both nations view the US and NATO as threats to their strategic interests. Over the past decades, NATO has continued its eastward expansion, moving closer to Russia's borders. The inclusion of countries like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in the alliance has bolstered the presence of military bases and advanced technologies in the region, which Moscow perceives as a direct threat to its security. Russia has long protested these actions, and the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO became one of the key drivers for the 2022 invasion. From Moscow's perspective, Ukraine's membership in the alliance would mean that a strategically important neighbor could become a staging ground for Western military operations. This view is reinforced by the ongoing buildup of military bases in Eastern Europe and the increasing frequency of NATO exercises near Russia's borders. China also feels encircled strategically, particularly with the presence of U.S. allies in Asia. Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines host key U.S. military bases, granting Washington significant influence in the region. U.S. operations in the South China Sea and support for Taiwan are viewed by Beijing as efforts to counter its ambitions for regional leadership. Additionally, sanctions imposed on Russia due to the war in Ukraine, combined with the U.S.-China trade war, have strengthened ties between Moscow and Beijing. Russia has turned to China as a primary market for its energy exports, while China relies on Russian natural gas and oil to fuel its rapidly growing economy. Joint military exercises and technological exchanges further solidify the bond between the two nations. China's purchase of Russian defense systems, such as the S-400, demonstrates trust and a shared readiness to counter Western pressure. China's Belt and Road Initiative also highlights this mutual support, with Russia serving as a critical transit corridor between Asia and Europe. Furthermore, BRICS offers an alternative to Western-dominated institutions like the IMF and World Bank. These institutions have often been criticized for their Western-centric policies, which prioritize the interests of the US and Europe while neglecting the specific needs of developing nations. This shift underscores the emergence of a more pluralistic global order. As the world focuses on the dynamics between East and West, one pressing question remains. Will the cooperation between Russia and China lead to a new world order? Or is it destined to remain a temporary partnership? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to watch my video on Huawei to learn more about the tech conflict driving this global rivalry.